شكرا لكم جميعا على الحضور والاستماع. ننتقل الآن إلى موضوع آخر اللي هو كلمة عن البيئة الحاضنة للابتكار والاستثمار في البحرين مع مجلس التنمية الاقتصادية في البحرين. يقدمها المدير الإداري لمجلس التنمية الاقتصادية في البحرين الأستاذ سايمون غالبن.
Hello. Thank you. I got my changer, yes. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Galpin. I work for Bahrain's Economic Development Board. And this afternoon, I'd like to share with you a few of the challenges that we face in really trying to grow Bahrain's emerging startup ecosystem. 2 years ago, I moved from what we think of as a small but hopefully very important part of China, the city of Hong Kong, to a small but important part of the Gulf, Bahrain. And what I would like to show is that the BahrainEDB, which is a traditional economic development agency that reaches out and attracts companies from all around the world to set up and expand their business in Bahrain, is now moving very heavily into promoting, supporting the thriving startup ecosystem. Now, the first challenge is that, when we started Start Me Up Hong Kong 5 years ago, there weren't that many countries really branding and promoting their startup ecosystem. Startup Chile, there are a few others around the world. But today, it's probably easier to say the countries that aren't supporting startups than the huge number that have put in place promotional mechanisms to support the startup ecosystem. And Bahrain's no exception. We have Startup Bahrain, which is an umbrella organization which involves both the private and public sector to really get behind the startup ecosystem, to help it to thrive, and then to promote it around the world. Now, because it's such a crowded ecosystem, because there are so many countries promoting fintech, promoting startups, another very big challenge for us is size. I mean, Bahrain is the smallest economy in the GCC. It's an island economy. And so getting your voice heard in this crowded space is a growing challenge. But what we're trying to do in Bahrain is to flip that. And it's to try and show that in some cases, small is beautiful. Because for startups, for investors, being a small economy means you have access. You have access to investors. And we have a tremendous concentration of high net worth individuals in Bahrain who we're educating and trying to become angel investors. You also have access to a few big corporates that could be your first big customer. But you have access also to decision makers and policy makers, and you can help shape some of those regulations because Bahrain's so small, because the government is accessible. And lastly, and probably most importantly, if you're based in Bahrain, you also have access to Saudi Arabia and all that's going on in this hugely dynamic, exciting market. So you're in the smallest economy in the GCC, but you have tremendous access to the largest economy in the GCC and to Eastern Province within Saudi Arabia. So that's very, very important. So those two challenges are quite real, but we feel that we're addressing them. The third challenge, and the one that I'll go into a bit more detail about, is this term, this buzzword that we use, ecosystem. Now, ecosystem is a very well-used word, and of course it comes from the natural ecosystem. And one of the key things about ecosystems is that they don't have to be the same to thrive. You can have a desert ecosystem. You can have a mountain ecosystem. You can have a Silicon Valley ecosystem. You can have a Dubai ecosystem. They don't have to be the same to be successful. But what they all need to thrive and to grow is balance. And so for many of us that are involved in supporting, nurturing, investing in startups, achieving that balance is absolutely crucial. And I'll give a few examples of the different types of balance that we have to try to reach. The first is a balance between government, public sector support, and the private sector. And generally speaking, you need a real partnership there. The government mustn't crowd out the private sector, but the government must be there to fill the gaps, to bring everybody together, to act as a catalyst to really grow the ecosystem. But you need the private sector to take a true leadership role. And in Bahrain, we have that. We have our accelerators, we have our incubators, we have investors that are very vocal and that are champions behind the whole Startup Bahrain branding. Even though they compete to a certain extent, they also come together. And that spirit of cooperation is very, very important for any good ecosystem. The second element of balance is whether you focus on attracting lots of foreign startups and scale-ups, or whether you focus on growing and developing your homegrown founders and entrepreneurs in the economy. And we feel in Bahrain that you need a bit of both. Dubai, for example, has been very successful in attracting teams from all around the world, but relatively unsuccessful in having true Emirati teams. Bahrain has some great homegrown startups, founders, entrepreneurs that are often partnering or working with Saudi entrepreneurs as well that can then work with these scale-ups, these entrepreneurs that come in from elsewhere. That interaction is very important because it gives your local startups that global dimension, raises the bar, but also raises their aspirations to go international once they establish that minimum viable product. The next element of balance that I'd like to touch on is over where and when you support startups at different stages. Now, because the ecosystems here are fairly young, we're spending a lot of time focusing on early seed stage startups, but we have to be careful there, because if governments provide too much support at the very beginning, you can sometimes lock an entrepreneur or a founding team into a product or service that actually needs to evolve into something else. They need to have the flexibility to pivot. And the other point, and not all startups would like to hear this, is that not every startup deserves to get funding at the first approach. So making sure that we provide a bit of funding at the beginning, and we're looking at providing funding through our sister organization, Tamkeen, that will provide funding up to a minimum viable product. Then ensuring that we've got a good pool of angel investors that are qualified and understand how to get involved in startups, right through to Series A and B is very important. And another thing that we're looking at to fill a gap is introducing a fund of funds that will introduce and bring in VCs from the region, from around the world, from a base in Bahrain to invest in startups in Bahrain, but also beyond. And then another element of balance is in whether you just focus on startups, or do you also have to bring the big corporates on board? The real economic benefit comes in bringing both together, taking traditional banks, taking traditional telcos, and getting them engaged and energized by what's going on in the startup space, giving them access to talent that only wants to work in the startup space and wouldn't really dream of joining a traditional corporate. So getting that interaction is very important. You can't only focus on startups. We recognize we need the big corporates on board too. So these are some of the things we're juggling with at the moment in Bahrain. We have a very thriving fintech space, and we believe Bahrain has tremendous potential to perhaps reinvent itself as a financial center on the back of its fintech cluster. So Bahrain's been a financial center, as you know, for 20 or 30 years. That means we've got a tremendous pool of professional talent in financial services. Most of those people are Bahrainis, and so many of those individuals we feel are well placed to move outside of traditional banking and either start their own or join fintech companies. And another space that hasn't really been claimed in fintech is Islamic fintech. Taking fintech products and services that have evolved in East Asia, in London and around the world, bringing them into this region and ensuring that they're Sharia compliant, and then opening those technology scale-ups and startups to a much bigger potential market and obviously a much bigger pool of potential investors. So again, we think Bahrain is well placed to do that as well. So, as I said, startup ecosystems are moving and emerging everywhere in the world. It's a very exciting time to be here in the Gulf. This is one of the most exciting startup ecosystems anywhere in the world now, even though it's at an early stage. And although the ecosystems here in Riyadh, in Bahrain, and UAE are very different, they are becoming increasingly interconnected. And we in Bahrain would love to work more closely with you here to ensure that all these ecosystems flourish, emerge, and grow from strength to strength in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.